They said I couldn't park my own tractor on my own land. Can you imagine that? One morning, I walked outside, coffee in hand, ready to start the day, and found a bright orange slit stuck to my door. At first, I thought it was some kind of delivery note, but no, it was an HOA violation notice. They claimed my tractor, sitting quietly at the edge of my driveway, was a problem. A fine was already listed in bold letters, like they were ready to hit me with punishment right out of the gate. For a second, I just stared at it, wondering if it was a joke. How could anyone look at a tractor and see it as a crime? That's when it hit me. This wasn't about a machine. This was about control. The HOA had been trying to show off their authority for months, nitpicking little things in the neighborhood. Someone's grass was an inch too high? Violation. A flower bed didn't match the approved color scheme? Violation. But a tractor? That was new. That was personal. And what they didn't realize was that I remember standing there, looking at the machine, thinking about how much sweat had gone into paying for it. Every long day of work, every extra hour, every job I took just to make sure I could buy it. To me, it wasn't just steel and paint. It was freedom. The ability to handle my land on my terms. And now, here was this group of people, neighbors who probably never even sat on a tractor, telling me it didn't belong. The more I thought about it, the more absurd it sounded. A tractor isn't noisy unless you run it. It isn't ugly, it's built tough, practical, reliable. And if it bothered anyone, well, it sat on my side of the property line, not theirs. Yet the letter acted like I had parked a wrecked car on the street. They even circled the words unsightly machinery, as if they were labeling some kind of crime scene. I couldn't help but laugh, but underneath that laugh was a spark of anger. This wasn't going to be something I ignored. I knew from the first second I read that paper, I wasn't going to just roll the tractor away and pretend it never happened. If anything, that little orange slip lit a fire in me. And here's the truth. When people push me into a corner, I don't just push back. I get creative. I find the one move they never saw coming. So while the HOA thought they were teaching me a lesson, what they were really doing was giving me an opportunity to take their little game, flip it upside down, and make sure they'd regret targeting me. And that all started with a single piece of paper taped to my door, and a tractor they thought they could erase from my life. The neighborhood looked calm from the outside, almost picture perfect. Neatly trimmed lawns, houses lined in straight rows, kids riding bikes down the sidewalks. To anyone passing through, it probably seemed like the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. But hidden behind that quiet surface was a group of people who lived for rules. They called themselves the board, the ones who ran the HOA, and they acted like kings and queens of the block. At the center of it all was the president, a woman who treated every little thing like a battle. She had the kind of smile that looked polite at first, but everyone knew she could turn that smile into a glare in a second. People in the neighborhood whispered about her, but most didn't dare to challenge her. She and the rest of the board believed the rules kept the neighborhood beautiful. They wanted every driveway clear, every paint color approved, every garden planted in straight lines. If one person stepped out of line, they saw it. The funny thing is, the tractor wasn't even parked in the street. It wasn't blocking anyone's view, and it wasn't left to rust. It was sitting proudly in my driveway, clean and ready for use. I used it to mow fields, haul wood, and maintain my land. It wasn't just equipment. It was the backbone of my work. But to them, it was nothing more than a giant red flag screaming violation. Neighbors started to notice too. Some of them gave me nods of approval when they passed by. They knew what tractors meant out here. Hard work, responsibility, independence. But others, the ones who wanted to stay in the board's good graces, avoided eye contact. It was as if my driveway had turned into forbidden ground. People walked their dogs on the other side of the street, pretending not to notice. I could almost hear their thoughts. Don't get involved. Don't end up on the board's bad side. It was strange, standing in the middle of all that. On one side, silence and fear. On the other, quiet support. And right in the middle was me, holding a notice that told me my own property wasn't mine to control. I looked back at the clubhouse that day, the big brick building the HOA used for meetings and parties. It stood like their little fortress, a place where they made decisions that affected everyone else. That's when something clicked inside me. That clubhouse represented their power, and the tractor represented mine. The board thought they could corner me with their letters and threats. But as I watched that building from my porch, an idea began to grow. They wanted me to move my tractor, to make it disappear like it was never there. Instead, I started thinking about what would happen if I brought my tractor a little closer to their world, if I stopped letting them decide what belonged where. That thought stayed with me, sharper than any fine they could throw my way. The first fine was annoying, but I figured maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe someone on the board didn't realize that a tractor wasn't the same as an abandoned car. But then the second notice came, and the third. Each one was harsher than the last, written in bold letters like they were shouting from the page. They accused me of violating aesthetic standards and threatened me with daily penalties if I didn't move it. I could almost imagine them sitting around their long wooden table in the clubhouse, passing around my name like it was a problem to solve. At first, I tried to reason with them. I wrote back, explaining that the tractor was essential for maintaining my land. I even offered to park it in a way that wasn't visible from the main road. But reason didn't matter to them. They weren't interested in compromise. They wanted submission. That's the thing about people who cling to power. Once you bend once, they expect you to bend every single time after that. The letters started piling up, and soon the threats weren't just about money. They hinted at towing, even though the tractor was parked on my own property. Imagine that, someone trying to tow away a machine that wasn't blocking anyone, wasn't abandoned, wasn't theirs to touch. The more I read their words, the more absurd it all felt. It wasn't about the tractor anymore. It was about proving they could control me. I noticed the shift in how people acted around me too. Some neighbors, the kind who'd always waved before, now looked nervous when they passed my driveway. Others leaned in and whispered when I walked by, asking quietly if I was really going to fight the board. It was almost like they were waiting for me to either cave in or cause a scene. I could feel the pressure building, not just from the HOA, but from the entire neighborhood holding its breath. Every time I saw that orange slip tucked against my door, I felt the same burn in my chest. They thought they could wear me down. They thought the constant flow of warnings and fines would eventually make me give in. But each notice had the opposite effect. It was like fuel on a fire I didn't even know I had. With every letter, my resolve grew stronger. I would stand in my driveway, looking at that tractor, and picture the board members shaking their heads at me. They wanted me to move it out of sight, to pretend it didn't exist. But that machine wasn't going anywhere. Not because I wanted to make a point, but because it was mine. It was part of my life. And if they were bold enough to think they could take that from me, then I needed to be bold enough to show them I wasn't going to be pushed around. The letters didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. One afternoon, I came home to find a thick envelope waiting in my mailbox. Inside were pages of official-looking documents filled with legal language, warnings, and threats. They said if I didn't comply, they would take me to court. They talked about liens, about seizing property, about the full weight of the law coming down on me. It was over the top, dramatic, and meant to scare me into submission. Most people would have panicked. Most people would have moved the tractor and begged for forgiveness. But all it did was make me laugh. They were writing checks with their mouths that they couldn't actually cash. Not long after, I started noticing cars slowing down in front of my driveway. The board members, dressed in their business casual outfits, would drive by slowly, staring like they were on patrol. Sometimes they would stop completely, pull out a phone, and snap pictures of my tractor. Neighbors saw it too, whispering about how far. Then came the meeting. They sent me a notice demanding that I attend the next HOA board session at the Clubhouse. They made it sound like a trial, like I was supposed to show up, sit down, and be lectured until I agreed to their terms. I didn't give them the satisfaction of showing up. Instead, I sat on my porch that night, drinking a cold beer, watching the clubhouse lights glow across the street. I imagined them inside, voices raised, papers shuffling, debating how to deal with the one neighbor who wouldn't bow. The next day, a new letter arrived, this one even more dramatic than the last. They said they would start fining me daily. Every sunrise would mean more money I supposedly owed. They thought that if they stacked the pressure high enough, I'd collapse. But here's the part they didn't count on. I had time, I had patience, and I had a stubborn streak wider than their entire clubhouse. Each step they took against me only carved my plan deeper into my mind. They wanted me to feel trapped, boxed in with no way out. But the more they cornered me, the more obvious it became that they had left themselves exposed. Their precious clubhouse, their meetings, their little empire, it was the beating heart of their power. And while they focused all their energy on my tractor, I started focusing all my energy on that building. I studied it every time I passed by. The windows, the parking lot, the signs on the wall. They saw a man with a tractor as a problem. I saw their clubhouse as an opportunity. And once the idea took root, there was no going back. The idea came to me late one evening while I was walking past the clubhouse. The lights were off, the parking lot empty, and the whole building sat there like a monument to their authority. It was where the board gathered to decide what everyone else could and couldn't do. Every rule, every fine, every notice. They all started in that building. I stopped on the sidewalk and just stared at it. And suddenly, the thought hit me. What if I flipped the script? What if the same building they used to control me became the very place I used to get my freedom back? I knew it wouldn't be easy. The HOA was strict, but like most organizations, they had blind spots. One of those blind spots was hidden in their own bylaws. I spent nights combing through pages of their rules, highlighter in one hand and a strong cup of coffee in the other. That's when I found it. A small section, buried deep, that allowed any community member to utilize shared spaces for maintenance purposes, as long as it didn't I. The first time I rolled the tractor up to the clubhouse, my heart raced. It wasn't just about parking it anymore. It was about making a statement. I parked it right outside, in the same lot where the board parked their cars for meetings. I left the hood open, tools laid out, and went about working as if it was the most normal thing in the world. Neighbors passing by slowed down, staring in disbelief. Some even smiled, shaking their heads like they couldn't believe I actually had the guts to do it. I knew it wouldn't stay quiet forever. Eventually, someone would notice, and the board would come storming in. But that was the whole point. I wasn't hiding anymore. I wanted them to see it. I wanted them to realize that for every notice they slapped on my door, I was turning their own space into mine. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. It didn't take long for the board to notice. The day finally came when I heard the sound of tires screeching in the clubhouse parking lot. 3 cars pulled up, doors slammed, and out marched the president and 2 other members, clipboards in hand, like they were about to conduct an inspection. I kept my cool, wiping grease off my hands as if I'd been doing this for years. The look on their faces when they stepped inside was priceless. Their perfect little meeting hall smelled of oil and fresh-cut metal. My workbench stood tall against the wall, tools neatly arranged, and the tractor sat proudly just outside the glass doors. The president's voice broke the silence first. She demanded to know what I thought I was doing, waving her papers in the air like they were supposed to scare me. I calmly pointed to the bylaws I had printed and taped to the wall. Section 14, Line 7, clear as day. Community members may utilize shared spaces for maintenance purposes. I read it out loud, slow and S. They tried to argue, of course, said I was twisting the rules, said I was abusing privileges. But the problem with people who rely on rules to control others is that they never expect someone to actually read those rules better than they do. Every time they raised a point, I countered with their own language. Every question they asked, I had an answer. By the end of it, their shouting turned into muttering, and muttering turned into silence. But the battle didn't end there. The board thought intimidation might still work. They started showing up at random hours, checking the clubhouse like they owned it. Each time, I made sure to be there, busy at work, smiling like I had all the time in the world. Neighbors caught on fast. Some came by just to watch, leaning against their cars with grins, whispering about how I'd managed to turn the board's biggest weapon into my personal workshop. For once, people weren't afraid. They were entertained. They wanted to see how far I would take it. The president hated that. She couldn't stand the sight of people enjoying my defiance. She called another emergency meeting, this time with the entire board present. They filed into the clubhouse in their suits and ties, only to sit in chairs surrounded by the sound of tools clicking and machines humming. It was like holding court in the middle of a construction site, and I just kept working, as if their presence meant nothing. Every glare, every whisper, every scribble on their notepads only fueled me more. They had spent weeks trying to isolate me, to make me feel small. Now they were the ones sitting in my space, powerless to stop it. And with every passing day, the clubhouse looked less like theirs and more like mine. Word spread faster than I ever expected. What started as whispers on sidewalks soon turned into full-on conversations at mailboxes and street corners. Neighbors who once avoided me were now stopping by, curious to see what I had done to the clubhouse. Some came in just to peek, eyes wide at the shelves stacked with tools, the smell of oil, and the sight of my tractor parked like a trophy out front. They couldn't believe I had pulled it off. And the best part? A lot of them secretly loved it. It wasn't long before the clubhouse became the most interesting spot in the neighborhood. Kids on bikes would ride past slowly, craning their necks to get a glimpse. Retired folks would wander by, shaking their heads with half smiles. Even the quiet ones, the neighbors who never said much, gave me a nod or a thumbs up as they walked their dogs. I had turned the board's pride and joy into a symbol of resistance, and people noticed. The HOA, on the other hand, was unraveling. The president's frustration was no longer hidden behind polite smiles. She showed up one morning, red in the face, demanding that I pack up and leave immediately. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply pointed to the same bylaw taped to the wall, the one they had ignored from the start. Her hand shook as she read it again, like she was hoping the words would change. They didn't. The rest of the board stood behind her, fidgeting, whispering, avoiding my eyes. They looked less like leaders and more like kids caught in a game they couldn't win. But here's what really stung them. The clubhouse was no longer just their meeting hall. It was my workshop, and by extension, the community stage. Every time I worked there, it reminded everyone of the board's failure to control me. Their fortress had been breached, and no matter how many letters or threats they threw, they couldn't undo it without rewriting their own rules. And rewriting rules meant admitting they had lost. I kept building, fixing, and parking my tractor in plain sight. The louder they shouted, the calmer I became. The more they tried to push me out, the more neighbors gathered to see what was happening. It turned into a show, with the board as the villains and me as the stubborn neighbor who refused to bow down. Each day felt like another episode in a story the whole community was watching unfold. The irony was too sweet to ignore. They had wanted me gone. They had wanted the tractor hidden, erased, forgotten. Instead, it became the centerpiece of the neighborhood, standing tall outside the very building they once used to boss everyone around. And every time the president walked past it, glaring, muttering under her breath, I knew one thing for certain. The war they started over a simple tractor had backfired in the loudest, most public way possible. The tension finally reached a breaking point one Saturday morning. The board called yet another emergency meeting, plastering notices on doors and sending emails filled with urgent wording. But this time, the turnout wasn't what they expected. Instead of a handful of quiet residents nodding along, the clubhouse filled with neighbors curious to see what would happen next. Chairs scraped, voices echoed, and people who had never once stepped foot inside before came just to witness the showdown. I was already there, of course, sitting at my workbench with a wrench in hand. The tractor was parked proudly just outside the glass doors, sunlight bouncing off its polished metal. You could feel the split in the room. On one side, the board members in their stiff clothes, clutching papers and glaring. On the other side, neighbors leaning back in their seats, arms crossed, waiting to be entertained. The president stood at the front, clearing her throat dramatically. She launched into a speech about community standards and respecting shared spaces. Her words were sharp, but her voice wavered just enough to give away the frustration underneath. I didn't interrupt. I let her finish every word, nodding slowly like I was paying close attention. When she finally slammed the papers down and demanded that I vacate immediately, I simply pointed once more to the bylaw pinned to the wall. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. People in the crowd shifted, whispering to each other. Some even chuckled quietly. For the first time, the board realized they weren't just fighting me anymore. They were losing their grip on the entire neighborhood. The room didn't belong to them. It belonged to everyone watching, and everyone was tired of the endless rules and fines. My workshop had become a symbol of something bigger, standing up to the ones who thought they could control Eve. The president tried to rally, raising her voice, threatening more fines and legal action. But her words didn't land the way they used to. Instead of fear, there was resistance. One neighbor spoke up, asking why the board cared so much about a tractor that wasn't hurting anyone. Another pointed out how much money was being wasted on chasing petty battles. The more the neighbors spoke, the smaller the board seemed. Their authority was slipping through their fingers, and they knew it. I didn't need to gloat or raise my voice. I just kept working, tightening bolts, the clink of metal echoing in the room like punctuation marks after every failed threat. Each sound reminded them that I wasn't moving, I wasn't hiding, and I wasn't afraid. By the time the meeting ended, the board looked exhausted, beaten down not by me alone, but by the very community they claimed to represent. People filed out of the clubhouse smiling, some clapping me on the shoulder as they passed. From that day forward, everything about the neighborhood felt different. The clubhouse, once their polished trophy, now carried the marks of my tools and the echo of my tractor's engine. Every time I rolled it up to the lot, people noticed. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a reminder that the board could be challenged and beaten. The HOA members tried to carry on like nothing had changed, but the cracks were impossible to ignore. Their meetings were quieter, their threats softer, their presence less intimidating. Neighbors who had stayed silent for months began speaking up. One family planted flowers in colors not on the approved list, daring the board to say something. Another parked their camper in the driveway for an entire weekend without asking permission. Bit by bit, the neighborhood started loosening the grip that the board had kept for years, and each small act of defiance pointed right back to that tractor parked outside the clubhouse. The president hated it most of all. I'd catch her walking past with her clipboard, scribbling notes furiously, though she knew none of it mattered anymore. The power she once had, the fear she thrived on, was gone. I could see it in her eyes every time she glanced at me. She wasn't looking at a rule breaker anymore. She was looking at the neighbor who had outsmarted her on her own battlefield. I didn't need to rub it in. I just kept going about my work. The clubhouse had become my space, and I treated it that way. Some nights, I'd leave the doors open, so the sound of tools carried into the street, making sure no one forgot what had happened there. Other times, I'd invite neighbors to stop by, to watch or chat while I worked. It wasn't just a workshop anymore. It was a gathering place, a place where people felt free to laugh, talk, and push back against the endless rules. And while the board tried to hold on to whatever authority they thought they still had, the balance had shifted permanently. They couldn't take back the image of me, standing inside their meeting hall, grease on my hands, tractor parked like a victory flag outside. They couldn't undo the fact that the community saw them lose control, live and in person. Every glare, every muttered word, every attempt to regain footing only reminded people of their failure. For me, the whole thing started with one orange slip taped to my door. They thought they could intimidate me with fines and letters, but they underestimated just how far I'd go to protect what was mine. In the end, I didn't just keep my tractor. I turned their symbol of power into my own workshop, and in doing so, I gave the neighborhood a reason to stop being afraid. The board wanted obedience. What they got instead was a reminder that some battles, once started, don't end the way you plan. The weeks that followed felt like living in a completely different neighborhood. The clubhouse no longer stood as a place of authority, but as a reminder of what had unfolded there. People who once avoided it now walked past with smirks, pointing it out to friends and visitors. Kids laughed as they rode by, calling it the Tractor House, and the name stuck. It spread so quickly that even the board couldn't escape it. Imagine being the president of the HOA and having your pride and joy turned into a running joke. Every time she walked through those doors, she had to hear whispers, chuckles, and the faint sound of a tractor engine in people's minds. I didn't stop working there. If anything, I leaned into it. I polished the tractor until it gleamed, parked it proudly outside, and kept the tools in perfect order inside. Each clang of metal, each hum of machinery, was another reminder that I wasn't backing down. Sometimes I caught neighbors standing in the doorway, curious, and I welcome. The shift was undeniable. Where there used to be fear, now there was laughter. Where there used to be control, now there was freedom. People started testing the boundaries more openly. A neighbor strung up lights that weren't approved. Another repainted their shutters without asking permission. And someone even left a kayak out in their yard for a week just to see what the board would do. The answer? Nothing. The board had been stripped of its power, and everyone knew it. The president tried one last time to rally. She sent out a long letter filled with warnings, reminders, and bold words about restoring order. But when it arrived in mailboxes, most people tossed it aside. Some laughed. A few even brought the letters over to my place just to compare them. The board's threats had lost all weight, like a dog barking behind a fence that no one believed would bite. And through it all, the tractor never moved. It stayed right where I wanted it, standing tall outside their precious building, like a monument to everything they failed to accomplish. The same machine they once called unsightly had become the symbol of strength in the neighborhood. I never set out to become some kind of hero. All I wanted was the right to keep my tractor where it belonged. But by fighting back, by refusing to bow down, I ended up proving something bigger. The board wasn't unbeatable. Their rules weren't unshakable. And the community, once silent, now had a voice. It all started with a single orange slip, but it ended with an entire neighborhood realizing they didn't have to live in fear of a few people with clipboards.